This is For Keeps With You. Baxter Boys, Book 5. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by Jay Dyess. Episode 6, Chapters 17 through the Epilogue. Chapter 17. A long time later, Roland pulled back. Their lips still clung, and Dusty pressed forward, placing small kisses on the corner of his mouth, unwilling to stop. Kissing on the floor held certain advantages, like taking away the fear of falling when her head swam and her knees felt weak. Roland returned each small kiss with one of his own. With you, one kiss always feels like more. I never told you to stop, she said, running her hand over his biceps and shoulder. If I don't stop now, I might not be able to later. His statement was punctuated by his rumbling stomach. Oh, I bet you never ate dinner. No, I guess I am kind of hungry. I don't even know what time it is. Must be late. She tried to untangle her legs from his. It's almost 11. I can make you a sandwich. I can make my own sandwich. You can keep me company. She laughed as they sat up, then managed to stand. Hang on, he said, and a few seconds later, his flashlight app lit up. There we go. Now you can walk without me worrying that you'll run into something and re-injure yourself. When is that worry going to go away? I'm going to have a hard time climbing mountains if you won't even let me navigate my living room by myself. His hand slid under her hair to grip the back of her neck. It's probably never going to go completely away. Is it so awful that I want to protect you? With those words, she remembered Janice and how she'd died in the same accident he survived. He'd never given her details, but it had to be hard to know he couldn't save her. I'm not really used to anyone caring, she finally said. I don't want to smother you, but you're gonna know I care. She smiled. His face looked craggy and fierce in the sharp light. I like that you care. Maybe something other than mountain climbing? Maybe, she agreed, picking her way around the coffee table and walking out to the kitchen where she flipped the small over-the-sink light on and opened the fridge. He came around behind her, his arms enclosing her. She leaned back into him, thankful to have someone behind her who would catch her when she fell. Like today. I said I'd do it, he growled in her ear. Your bear voice doesn't scare me, she replied flippantly, leaning forward to grab cold cuts and mayo. He moved back. Really? I'll have to work on that. She laughed, closing the fridge as he walked to the counter and grabbed bread. Are you eating too? He asked. To her surprise, she was actually hungry. Yeah, I think I will. He grinned, looking her over. You seem a little happier. He set the bread down and opened the bag. Now, I know your friends were here, but I'm just thinking it was me kissing you that made all the difference. She laughed outright. Nope. It was the idea that I could replace motocross with something else. Something challenging. Something I can push myself to win on. He spun around. What? He stalked toward her. I'm thinking I didn't kiss you long enough or hard enough if you've got any thoughts left in your head. Any. He put his hands on her shoulders. She wrapped her arms around his neck. I was kidding. It was your kiss. It was definitely your kiss that made me smile. Dusty woke up in her bed, the memory of the day before in fragments. The devastation of finding out she would never race again. The anger at Roland for not telling her. her friend's support, Roland's tender care and sweet teasing. His replacement suggestion. His kiss. She stretched and rolled, pulling the covers more snugly around her. Before he'd gone, he'd let her know that he hadn't gotten into any trouble at work over Abigail, and with his words of encouragement in her ear and her lips still tingling from his kiss, he'd left. She'd thought of something to replace motocross. She'd actually thought of it the night before, but she didn't want to say anything to Roland. First of all, it had been years since her last lesson, and secondly, she wanted to surprise him. He had so much confidence and faith in her, and not only that, but he'd been so supportive, not only with her therapy and with helping her, but he'd spent the entire evening holding her last night, teasing her out of her funk, kissing her. She wanted to make him smile. And she was going to start today. She'd taken lessons for a year back when she was 18. As soon as she got up, she was going to look up the number for the regional airport and see if Whiff was still there giving flying lessons. Thursday morning, Roland dropped his car off at Tuff's shop for tires. He rode to work with Matt, who worked in imaging. They weren't late, but normally Roland walked in at least 30 minutes early, not at 1 minute till. As soon as he walked into the office, the ominous air hit him. There was no chatter. No one greeted him. Even Abigail stood in a corner, her head buried in a chart. Roland had the strongest urge to turn around and walk back out, closing the door behind him. But he'd not gotten where he was by avoiding the hard thing, so he walked in, his head up. This had to be about him, and it was almost certainly about his relationship with Dusty. Today was the first day his supervisor, Craig, was back. Abigail was in too convenient of a position for her to have not told on him. He walked to the small kitchen room and put his lunch in the fridge. He didn't even have the door shut when he heard Craig's voice. "Has he gotten here yet?" Craig hadn't said a name. Roland didn't need him to. "I'm in here." The doorway darkened. Roland's chest darkened in the same manner. He turned. "I need to see you in my office." Roland lifted his chin and followed him out. Craig waited for him to walk through. The office had a shelf of books on one wall and a large picture of the ocean on the other. Several plants sat in stands on the floor. A large window looked out over the green grass behind the building. Craig carefully closed the door behind himself and walked to his desk. Roland didn't sit down, and Craig didn't invite him to. Craig leaned his butt against the corner of the desk and folded his hands over his chest. "I have a problem," Craig finally spoke. Roland kept his gaze level. He didn't flinch or look away. Craig sighed. "A big problem." Roland waited. "Here's my dilemma. This week, while I was gone, I got 2 phone calls. One from a professional football team. One of their guys lives not far from here, and he hurt himself this past season. He's been working with the team therapist, but it's getting to be a hassle, and he wants someone closer. They want to transfer him to our practice." Here Craig paused. His stare seemed to intensify. "To you. They specifically asked for you." Roland allowed one side of his mouth to curve up. It was a huge honor, and they both knew it. "I got another phone call from the state college here in town. Their nationally ranked girls' basketball team wants to use us as their official therapy center. Again, you. They mentioned you specifically." Roland waited. Craig wasn't smiling, and this was all big news. There should be smiles. Obviously, there was another shoe that was going to drop. But I received a report via email yesterday. A person in this office claims they saw you with a client, kissing her. That's going to be a little hard to explain to the girls' basketball team, especially." He tilted his head. "Actually, I guess I only assumed the client you were kissing was a woman." He waited with brows lifted. Roland didn't bother to answer his implied question. "This accusation is not only hard to explain, it's going to devastate your career. Unfortunately, it could also bankrupt our therapy center as well. We depend on these sports teams in the area to look to us. Currently, you're the one that draws them in." He paused, a shadow of fear crossing his face before he schooled his features. "Roland, I need to know. Is the report wrong? Did anyone else see? Can we deny it?" The murmur of voices came through the door. Something clicked. Craig's desk creaked as he shifted on it. "Abigail saw me with Dusty Gibson last weekend." Recognition flared in Craig's eyes. Dusty was a client here. She wasn't allowed to drive, and getting a ride here was burdensome for her. Craig listened intently. "Full disclosure, though, I offered to do therapy at home with her under the umbrella of our group." He had never been inappropriate with Dusty during the therapy sessions. Billed through our group, of course. Craig's face clouded again. "As you know, I have my own business license and have done private sessions in the past. Since she already started here as a client, I didn't take her away but billed her insurance company at the home therapy rate." Craig nodded. "She took me up on it, and I've been doing therapy with her at home for the last few weeks." He faced Craig, head on. "And yes, I was out with her this weekend, and yes, I kissed her. Multiple times." He didn't bother to mention Abigail's proposition to him, asking him out on a date with her last Friday in the office. It was at the end of the day. Although it might be technically against the rules, it didn't bother him, and he wasn't going to report it. It felt too much like tit for tat back in elementary school. If it bothered him, he should have, and would have, reported it at the time. Not waited until a convenient time to get her in trouble. Craig rubbed his chin. "I don't suppose you're married to Dusty?" Roland snorted. "No." The idea was not repulsive. Not to him. "Because that would make this whole thing go away. If you two were married, there would be no issue. You can kiss your wife any time." "We're not." Craig continued to look at him with lifted brows. "We have no plans in that direction. Dusty didn't want to be married. She had a new mountain to climb. Hopefully, figuratively speaking." "Could you be persuaded? If I can say you're married, I don't have to say exactly when it happened, and this whole thing could go away." "I'd marry her today if I could. She's not ready, and I'm not pushing her. Not to save my butt." "I don't care about your butt. It's your reputation that's at stake." "I'm not sacrificing Dusty on the altar of my reputation." "What about the altar of this therapy group?" "Dusty is more important." "Then she's a fool if she won't marry a man who would sacrifice his career for her." "She's not going to find out about any sacrifices on my part." He lowered his chin, his eyes dark. "She'd better not." Craig held up his hands. "Fine, whatever. If you're kissing her off the clock, that's technically fine. However, if this thing blows up, I have no choice but to fire you." The back room was deserted when Roland walked out of Craig's office. Although he was already behind schedule, Roland walked to the small kitchen area and pulled a water out. He should be more upset about possibly losing his job. it should bother him. He should be scared and devastated, but he almost felt like it was time to move on anyway. Maybe that was the restlessness that he'd felt since being with Dusty. He didn't hear Abigail come in, but when he turned, she stood in the door. Anger surged hot inside of him. Why had she felt the need to run to Craig about what he was doing when she knew she'd broken the rules too? She bit her lip. Her smirk had been replaced by an expression that looked almost contrite. His anger still simmered inside. "You didn't tell on me," she said softly. "No." "Why not?" He told her the truth. "If it bothered me, I would have reported it when you did it. You accepted my no, and that's all there was." She nodded. "I see." He figured she did. He still didn't trust her. She looked at him from under her lashes. "I know you're angry at me, but I think I can fix this." Her expression shifted, and he caught a glimpse of the sly woman he knew her to be. "I need a favor from you." The anger in his chest bubbled and popped. How could she think he'd do a favor for her now? He waited. "The blonde guy that was with you on Saturday?" Tucker. She had to be talking about Tucker. "He drove a Jaguar?" She prompted when he didn't respond. Had Tucker been driving a Jaguar? He hadn't noticed. He raised one brow. "Set me up with him, and I'll tell Craig that I'll go on record saying that I originally thought it was you and Dusty, but in hindsight, I was wrong." He flinched at Dusty's name. It was one thing for him to lose his career, a huge thing, no mistake. But Dusty was so much more important that he couldn't even begin to match the depth of emotion he felt when Abigail said her name. Protective feelings rose up hot and strong within him. He'd do whatever it took to keep her safely out of this. He would call Tucker and see if he'd go along with this. If he would, it would keep Dusty from ever hearing about any of it. She had enough to deal with. "I'll see what I can do." Abigail's smirk was back. Roland made a mental note to warn Tucker about her, to caution him not to let his guard down with her. "I can't make him fall for you," he added. "I know. All I ask is a chance, a date. The rest is up to me. If you get me that far, I will do exactly what I just said and make sure Craig knows there is nothing to that email I sent him." "I want it in writing." "I'll copy you on the email." Chapter 18. Roland thanked Matt for the ride and got out in front of Tuff's garage. The big overhead door was open, and he could hear the old men arguing from out here. He came to a stop when he saw a Harley sitting on the far side of the garage door with a for sale sign stuck to the handlebars. Nothing fancy, but still a Harley. He'd never been in Dusty's garage, and she'd only this week been given the okay to start driving. If she hadn't been joking about riding it to therapy and she really had a bike, he'd never seen it. The doctor had told her no racing, not no riding motorcycles. Maybe this was something she could do to take the place of motocross. He walked over and walked around the bike before shaking his head and stepping into the cool interior of the garage. His car sat in the far bay, the tires on. The old man at the checkerboard didn't even look up, let alone stop arguing. Tuff wasn't out in the garage, so Roland walked to his office door. The old man never noticed him. He smiled to himself, wondering if that would be him someday. Tuff's door was cracked, and Roland knocked lightly before pushing it open. Tuff sat at his computer, typing away. He looked up and nodded before finishing what he was typing and pushing back from the desk. "Car's done." Roland walked in and pulled the door closed behind him. not latching it, but keeping out the arguing of the old men. "Yeah, I saw." He handed his card over. "I didn't see an invoice, but you always treat me fair. Run it before I leave, and I won't have to send a check." Tuff did some clicking before swiping Roland's card on his portable reader and printing out a receipt. He handed the card back. "Saw the bike out front." Tuff pushed back, rolling his chair back and pulling the receipt out of the printer. He held it in his hand for a moment before looking at Roland with a considering gaze. "I think she'd like it. Matches the one she has." He handed Roland the receipt. Roland grunted, taking the paper. Tuff always seemed to be 2 steps ahead of him. "I wasn't sure she had one. Never been in her garage." He looked at the desk where a picture of Kelly holding their kids was framed. "I've never ridden one, don't know anything about them." Tuff's serious brown eyes narrowed. "Might be time to take a few chances." Roland had the feeling he meant more than buying a bike he didn't know anything about. Tuff went on. "Kid that's selling it is a good guy. Bought it new and can't afford the payments. He's selling it for what he owes. It's a good deal." That was more talking than Roland usually heard from Tuff. He nodded, trying to look like he knew what he was doing. "She's perfect for you. Maybe a bit fast, but don't let that scare you. Like I said, might be time to take a few chances." Roland stared at Tuff. He'd thought at first he was talking about the bike, but after studying the expression on Tuff's face, he wasn't so sure. Actually, he was pretty sure he wasn't talking about the bike. Tuff hadn't said Dusty's name once, but maybe he shouldn't have to. Roland thanked him and walked out, considering. He wasn't exactly a conservative bookkeeper who was afraid of his own shadow. What was Tuff trying to say? Dusty stretched and turned off her computer. The last few weeks had flown by. She only needed therapy once a week, but she still saw Roland almost every day. He was coming over this evening, in fact. He'd said he had a surprise for her. Well, she had a surprise for him, too. She'd been taking flying lessons every morning. Everything she'd learned from her lessons a few years ago came back fairly easily, and her instructor, Whiff, had told her she was ready to man the controls herself. He'd also said she could bring along a guest. Whiff would be with them, but she could still hardly contain her excitement. She'd kept the lessons a secret from Roland, just because she wanted to surprise him. She'd listened to his advice and found something to take the place of motocross. Not that she didn't still miss it. She did. But the awesomeness of soaring several thousand feet above the earth, flying through clouds, and watching the ground race by was more than worth it. She hadn't decided if she was going to pursue a career as a pilot or if she was going to continue to keep it as a hobby. Her design business was doing okay. She could live on the income, especially since she'd gotten several consulting jobs directly related to motocross. Those jobs didn't have anything to do with graphic design, but they paid pretty well. Still, she'd rather fly. Something about being in the air, the thrill, the little bit of danger, and the speed. Definitely more invigorating than sitting behind a computer working with designs. The only problem with being a pilot, she had a deepening desire to settle down. With Roland. She knew he wanted a family that was together all the time. If she pursued a career as an airline pilot, not only would it take a lot of flying hours, but she'd end up staying in different cities almost every night. With luck, she might be home 2 nights a week. She loved flying, and to her, the sacrifice might be worth it. But to Roland, she didn't want to ask him to give up his dream of a tight-knit family. A knock on her door had her hurrying to answer. "I've got it, Blanche," she called to her housekeeper who was preparing dinner. It was probably Eve at the door. She'd called earlier and was going to swing by, dropping off Dusty's purse, which she'd left at Riley's when she'd visited the new baby last evening with Roland. She opened the door with a big smile, which froze in surprise. Tucker stood on the step. "Don't look so happy to see me." She laughed. "I'm sorry. I was expecting someone else. Come on in." "Roland?" Tucker asked. "Are you and he still fake seeing each other?" "We're actually real seeing each other now," Dusty said, closing the door behind him. "But he won't get off work for another hour." "Big surprise." Tucker gave her a grin, and she smiled back. Yeah, it wouldn't be a big shock to him that Roland and she were together. She never noticed the cleft in his chin. It was adorable. His blue eyes sparkled, and she realized with a start that Tucker would be considered handsome by most of the female population. "I'm actually here because of you and him." "Huh? Didn't he tell you about some woman named Abigail?" Tucker asked, his brows going up in surprise. "No?" Tucker pressed his lips together, but it was too late now. "What about Abigail?" "She's the one that saw you guys kissing when I was here a few weeks ago. She turned Roland in, but she said she'd take it all back if he set up a date with me." At that, Tucker laughed. 5 minutes ago, Dusty would have laughed even harder, but Tucker, with his broad shoulders and strong jaw, was actually a good-looking guy. She had a bad first impression because of his dad. "I think she found out our family has money somehow." He shrugged. Dusty wasn't so sure, but she didn't argue. Why wouldn't Roland have told her about that? It wasn't like they didn't see each other almost every day. Maybe he just forgot. Although she had a hard time thinking that Roland would forget about something that probably jeopardized his whole career. "So you agreed to a date to save Roland's career?" "No. Actually, I agreed to a date to keep—" The doorbell rang. "Oh, just a minute." Dusty turned, calling, "I've got it, Blanche," again, walked a few feet back and opened the door. Eve, having obviously come from her job at the diesel repair shop, since she had black grease on her face and up both arms, held Dusty's purse out away from her greasy clothes with 2 fingers. Her teeth gleamed white in her face. "Sorry, I've got the hook, and I'm on the way to pick up a wreck." Her voice trailed off. Dusty looked back over her shoulder to see what had caught Eve's eye. Tucker stood with his mouth open. When he realized they were both looking at him, he threw his hand out and rushed forward, like he was going to introduce himself. Unfortunately, he tripped over the potted plant on the floor, bumping the coffee table and knocking the lamp off. He leaped to grab the lamp, which he caught, but the tree fell in front of him, and he tripped over it again. This time he flew forward, face down. The lamp flew out of his hand, the cord ripping from the wall. The lamp hit the side of the open door with a crash and shattered into a million pieces that fell to the floor with an elongated tinkling sound. Silence descended on the house. Blanche appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Is everyone okay?" Dusty had thrown an arm up to shield her eyes, and as far as she could tell, she was okay. But a big streak of red was pouring out of Eve's cheek, just below her eye. "Oh, wow!" Dusty looked closer. "Don't move, Eve. There's still a piece of glass in your cheek." "I can feel it." Eve closed her eye. "I know this is going to sound crazy, but I don't have time. I'm on my way to an accident and I have to leave. Right now. But there's glass in your face. It will have to wait." Dusty grabbed the purse Eve still held. Eve gave a heroic attempt at a grin. "There will be medics on the scene. Don't worry, I'll be fine." She did not look at Tucker as he scrambled to his feet. She was already out the door and headed back down the sidewalk before he was up and had reached the doorway. "I'm sorry," he shouted after her. He turned to Dusty. "I should go after her." "No, she said she was on the way to an accident. Better let her go." Dusty watched as she jogged to the big tow truck and climbed in, moving down the driveway almost immediately. She closed the door. "I'm sorry." Tucker looked around at all the colorful pieces of broken glass on the floor. "Where's the broom? I'll start cleaning it up." Chapter 19. Roland pulled into Dusty's drive on the bike that had been sitting at Tufts. He had not only bought it, but gotten his motorcycle permit and been driving it back and forth to work, as well as taking it out for an hour or so in the mornings before work. Dusty didn't know about it, yet, since he always parked it and took his car to her house. He'd wanted to wait until he felt comfortable on it and like he could keep up with her if they went out together. He knew she'd be a better driver than he was, and he was okay with that, but he at least wanted to appear competent. The bike was loud enough that she heard him, like he'd figured she would, and she was standing on the walk in front of her house as he came to a stop in her drive. He lifted his helmet up, and her blue eyes just about popped out of her head. He had to smile. He'd wanted to surprise her. Mission accomplished. "I am shocked." He grinned, bumping the kickstand down and dismounting. There was definitely a gleam in Dusty's eye as she watched, and he made a mental note to himself to thank Tough. He'd do pretty much anything to have Dusty look at him like that. She laughed and came running. He grabbed her up in a hug, spinning her around. "I can't believe you're riding a Harley," she gasped between laughs. "Is it yours? Did you buy it?" Her excitement was contagious, and he couldn't stop grinning as he answered. "Yep, it was sitting at Tufts. Tuff said I needed some excitement in my life. Or something like that." "Wow." She strode over and walked around it. "Tuff definitely knows what he's talking about. This is about the best thing ever." Her shining eyes lifted to his. "Is this your surprise?" "Yep," he said proudly. He felt pretty good about himself. This was definitely a great surprise. Her smile got even bigger. "I'll get mine out, and we can ride together to go to my surprise?" He nodded, laughing. "Sure, we have to go to your surprise?" She got a little secret smile on her face and rubbed her hands together. "Yep, and my surprise is every bit as good as yours." "You definitely look excited about it," which made his heart beat faster. She came around the bike and slipped back into his arms. "I love your bike. I love that you bought it because you know I love riding." Her glowing face looked up into his. "I love you." His eyes flew open. His arms tightened around her. His heart scudded and skipped like crazy in his chest. He stared down at her big, deep blue eyes. Time seemed to stand still as his smile faded. He reached up and brushed her hair with his hand. "I love you." He swallowed. "It scares me how much." Her lips curved up again, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. "This is where you kiss me." "This is where I confirm that I'm not your fake boyfriend anymore." "You're my real boyfriend." He hesitated, but the words on the tip of his tongue wouldn't be stilled. He had to make sure this was a long-term thing. "I want to marry you." The shock rolled through her body under his hands. She blinked, and his heart trembled. But then her lips curved up again. "Are you asking me to marry you?" No, I'm telling you what I want. He begged her with his eyes to understand. I want to make sure that you know this is not a passing thing for me. I'm not ever going to walk away from you. A shadow crossed her face, and he felt instant guilt for poking her in her vulnerable spot, but he needed her to know how much she and what they had together meant to him. You know how hard it is for me to trust that anyone will stay. She closed her eyes. But I know you mean it. I know you'll never walk away from me. This is where I kiss you. He lowered his head and kissed her cheeks and the tip of her cute, upturned nose before touching his lips to hers. She clutched at his neck, and he held her tighter, lifting her up and swinging her around, their mouths and bodies both pressed together while the world spun. He set her down and stepped back. If we're going to make it to see your surprise, we'd better go. Although, if you want to show me some other time, I'd be more than happy to keep kissing you. Her mouth formed an O. We better get going. Let me run in and get my leather jacket and put boots on. Come on, Blanche made a snack in case you were hungry. He followed her in, chatting and eating while she changed. Then he helped her get her Harley out of the garage. His life up to that point felt dull and colorless. Riding down the drive, beside Dusty, with her slightly in the lead, gave him an amazing feeling that swelled almost to bursting in his chest. He could hardly stand how wonderful it felt to know that the amazing woman beside him loved him. He admired her slender form in the black jacket and dark helmet, her hair all tucked up inside. Keeps it from knotting up, she'd said with a grin when he asked her why she didn't let it out and down. He needed to buy her a ring. Now that he knew exactly what he wanted and knew she'd take him, he wanted to put a ring on her finger right away. Be a family, settle down, be together, grow old together. Once she showed him her surprise, he'd take her out to eat. They could hash out the details. Maybe he could push her for a fall wedding, a late summer wedding. They could elope this weekend. He grinned and almost missed her hand signal to turn right. He stayed slightly behind her, allowing her to lead the way, still enmeshed in his daydreams of the happily ever after he was going to have. Maybe they could talk about whether he should step out and start his own business, or talk to... He came out of his daydream with a start when she signaled a left and took the road directly in front of the big Brickley Springs Regional Airport sign. It had been years since Janice's death on the runway, but he hadn't been to an airport since, and as they drove their bikes along the fence which separated the road from the landing strip, his heart squeezed painfully before it tried to jump up into his throat. He took a calming breath. There was a restaurant back here, too. Or maybe she'd had something delivered to the airport. Yeah, that must be it. She'd bought something and had it delivered to the airport. Now they were picking it up. He forced his gasping lungs to calm down. The sky that had been bright blue just moments ago darkened, and a chill breeze blew across the tarmac. He glanced at the sky. Thunderclouds billowed in black columns. After the heat of the day, a thunderstorm wasn't unexpected, but the same dark clouds seemed to billow in his chest. She parked her bike and hopped off, taking her helmet off and shaking her hair out. Her smile had only grown bigger and wider. He forced his lips to turn up and tried to settle his stomach. She was picking something up. He didn't even need to look at any of the 5 or so planes on the tarmac, let alone touch them or get in them. Are you okay? Dusty asked, walking over and laying a hand on his shoulder. He hooked his helmet over his bike. Kinda looks like rain.
Yeah, these babies don't like to get wet, but I'll show you how to take care of them later tonight.
She waggled her brows at him.
But first, my surprise.
She took his hand and dragged him through the airport doors. Since it was a small regional airport, there were very few people milling around and even fewer TSA agents. He barely saw the polished floors and high windows, the doors she opened and the hall they walked down. But the choking feeling in his throat got thicker and heavier. He felt like he could smell smoke and the acrid, burning scent of raw fuel, feel the heat as the flames shot up, and worst of all, hear Janice's screams as the flames licked at her. He shook his head. They stood outside now, and Dusty shook him.
Are you okay?
She asked for a second time. He nodded, his eyes on a man, tall, slightly stooped with steel-gray hair, walking toward them.
That's Whiff,
she said to Roland. She grinned as Whiff strode up and stopped with his hand out. Dusty shook it and then indicated Roland.
Whiff, this is Roland. Roland, this is Whiff, my flight instructor.
Her bright eyes shone into his. This was her surprise and her excitement. This is what she'd wanted to tell him, to show him. He tried to get his lips to function, but she was speaking again.
I took lessons after I graduated from high school, but motocross took up all my time and I quit. After you said to replace motocross with something else, this came immediately to mind.
Her smile hadn't slipped, but her brows drew together just a little, like she was concerned about him. Still, she continued.
Today is the first day that I get to take someone with me.
She squeezed his hand.
It means a lot to me, and I wanted you to be with me.
She tilted her head, maybe at his lack of response.
I wanted to share this with you.
She's ready, Whiff said. She's got a steady hand on the controls and a cool head in the air. He gave Dusty a look like a proud father might give his child. I can tell she's raced competitively. She's got everything it takes to make an exceptional pilot. He nodded, slapping his gloves against his pant leg. I've seen men leave the Air Force with less control than she has. Dusty beamed. Part of Roland beamed with her. Her dad might not be here to share the moment, but Whiff was just as proud of his protege. A gust of wind blew, pushing into them and rattling a metal can down against the building. Whiff looked around at the sky. I'd like to get in the air before those storm clouds come any closer, or we won't be flying tonight. Sudden realization made Roland stiffen, then shake. He had to get in the plane. He looked at Dusty. He didn't want to disappoint her or let her down in any way, but he turned to Whiff. I need to talk to Dusty for 1 minute, please. Sure, I'm going to go do a pre-flight. Whiff turned. Dusty nodded, her face drawn with concern.
If you're not well, I understand. We can postpone it.
Somewhere in his brain, he realized he had been considering making some excuse, trying to put her off, maybe just getting out of it for today. But Roland knew that was wrong. He needed to come clean. Dusty needed to know the whole story about Janice. He put his hands on her shoulders, squaring her to face him, then dropped them. He couldn't touch her. You know Janice died in an accident. Dusty nodded. Her brows remained knitted, but as he waited, he saw realization steal over her.
An airplane crash?
She whispered. He nodded.
When you said crash, I assumed a car crash.
My fault. I avoid talking about it, and I only said what was necessary to you.
Okay.
I'm telling you everything now. She had her pilot's license.
I thought she was going to be a doctor.
Yeah. She started taking lessons in high school and got enough hours in to get her license before we even started med school. She loved it. Dusty nodded. He was sure she could relate. I rode with her a lot, but never caught the bug to pilot. He hooked a hand around the back of his neck and rubbed, like that would help ease the tightness in his spine. I don't know what happened. It was right after taking off. The plane went up, then came down. It burst into flames, from the fuel, I guess. I don't know. You saw my scars. She nodded again, biting her lips and fingering her hair. The pain from the flames was beyond anything I ever felt before, but at least I could get out. He swallowed. She was wedged between the door and her seat, with the controls in her lap. He took a breath. Screaming. The fuel must have splashed up on her side somehow. I really don't know. I didn't take the time to examine the wreckage. But her seat was on fire. Her clothes. Flames all around. Smoke. And that awful smell. He paused. I was able to get her out. He couldn't go into the details, even now. He'd been thankful for his pocket knife that day, but he'd never carried one since. He'd never live that nightmare again. But not in time for her to be saved. A shudder ran through him. I quit med school because the recovery was awful and I never wanted to be in a hospital again. My therapists were great, and I decided I'd rather help people that way. He dropped his hand back down to his side. I'm sorry. I should have told you earlier, but I hate reliving the memories. He silently begged her to understand. I never thought the topic would come up, but I haven't been in a plane since. She stepped toward him and wrapped her arms around him. Relief flooded through him. She understood. She would quit flying. She'd find something else to replace motocross. They'd find something else to do together. Maybe mountain climbing wasn't so bad after all. He glanced over at Whiff. Maybe you better tell him you changed your mind. Her jaw dropped, and he knew immediately he'd been wrong. She didn't even have to open her mouth, but she did.
Maybe it's time for you to face that fear.
He dropped his arms and backed away. She couldn't mean it. She couldn't be that calloused. Face that fear. Like his fear of flying was a phobia based on an overactive imagination? You don't understand. Did you not see my legs? Did you not hear me? I cut off my girlfriend's arm while she was burning to death and screaming in my ear in a plane that could have exploded at any second, and I still didn't save her. He didn't realize he was yelling until Dusty stepped back. He shoved a hand through his hair. I'm sorry. Dusty stood looking at him, like she was expecting him to change his mind. No. He shook his head. No. Her blue eyes held his. He couldn't look away, but he also couldn't give her the answer she wanted. No. Why are you asking me to do the one thing I can't? He realized she didn't look surprised at all when he turned on his heel and walked away. Chapter 20. Dusty watched Roland walk away. She should have expected it. She pushed that thought away. Roland had been scarred by what had happened to him. That didn't mean he was walking away from her. But it probably meant she'd have to decide between being a pilot and being with Roland. She snorted. She loved flying. It was as close to racing as she could come. But she loved Roland more. He was already halfway back to the building. She ran after him. Before she reached him, he stopped, putting a hand to his head. She slowed to a walk. What was he doing? Slowly, he turned. His eyes widened when he saw her just 10 feet away. His eyes held pain and disillusionment, but there was hope there too, and that hope spurred her back into a run. He held his arms out, and she jumped into them.
I told you I loved you, and I meant it. If that means I don't fly, then I don't fly.
He shook his head. There were tears on his face, and she brushed them off, holding his cheeks in her hands. No, the fear is real, but as I was walking away, the fear of losing you overshadowed everything else. He looked over her head to the airplane that waited for them. I don't know if I can get on it today. His eyes seized hers. But I will. I'm not going to allow fear to run my life. Not now, not ever. I will fly with you. I promise. Whiff came over. A gust of wind blew them sideways. He waited for it to pass before he spoke. That storm's too close. I think we better stay on the ground for today.
That's fine,
Dusty said. Maybe we could go over and look at the airplane, Roland said. Dusty's gaze snapped to him. Sure, Whiff shrugged. Maybe we could sit in it, Roland said. Dusty smiled. It's not locked. Whiff got a sly grin on his face. Maybe you're going to want to take lessons. Roland looked at Dusty. Her blonde hair blew in the wind. She put a hand up to hold it out of her face. He put his hand up to cover hers. No, he said. I think I'll be content to fly away with Dusty. Epilogue. Tucker Burns looked around. This was the simplest wedding he'd ever been to. It was also the most fun. Someone's big front yard had been transformed into a beautiful fairy tale. Tables ringed a carpeted square where a string quartet played classical favorites as well as more upbeat contemporary songs. Strings of lights hung between poles, giving the place an ethereal feel now that the sun had almost set. Directly at the foot of the square, his aunt, Dusty, and her new husband, Roland, sat at a table, laughing and talking to each other. As he watched, they rose, Roland taking her hand, and walked to the grassy area beside the carpeted square. Dusty barely limped. Amazing that it wasn't that long ago that she'd broken her back. But now she was only a couple 100 hours away from being a licensed pilot. Although he'd heard she'd been busy helping her fiancé, now husband, start his own therapy practice. Tucker had taken Abigail out and made sure that Roland hadn't gotten fired, but Roland hadn't spent much more time at that practice before he'd gone out on his own. With Dusty. She'd designed his logo and his signs. She'd also made his website, which, in Tucker's opinion, was the best website he'd ever visited. In his research for Roland's loan application, Tucker had combed through everything. In the end, the loan had been easy to approve. On Roland's merits, not because of Dusty. He'd always admired her, not that he'd seen her that much in person. He'd followed her on the motocross circuit, with occasional visits on holidays. She had fire and sass, but it was tempered by grace and class. His mother had the class. She looked over at where his parents sat, their backs pointed to each other. But it was calibrated by snobbishness and a short temper. He lifted the pulled pork sandwich and took a bite, careful not to get any on his suit. After working in the banking industry for the last 4 years, his suit felt like a second skin. It was great camouflage.
Tucker, honey, get me some more punch.
Abigail blinked and pouted her lips. He took her glass and rose dutifully. Abigail was a woman very similar to his mother, and he knew how to handle her. Roland hadn't known it when he'd asked Tucker for the favor of asking her out. Tucker had been happy to do whatever it took to help Dusty and Roland get together. If there was ever a couple meant to be, it was them. He looked at them again as they swayed together. Perfect for each other. There were a lot of tough dudes at this wedding. Tucker was in the minority with his suit. A few of them wore dress pants, but most of them wore jeans and a button-down shirt. Maybe cowboy boots in lieu of dress shoes. One man even had a tie paired with his jeans. Another fellow had a handgun strapped to his side. Tucker didn't feel as out of place as one would expect. This was the world that she came from. It wasn't hard to find her. He'd been fighting himself to keep his eyes from tracking her movements all afternoon. She wore a dress and low heels. There was no cleavage and her knees were covered, but in Tucker's eyes, she was the sexiest woman here. She looked delicate and feminine with small diamonds in her ears and her hair piled on her head, her elegant neck encircled by a gold chain. Camouflage. He'd seen her with grease on her face, wearing slim blue jeans and driving a 40-ton truck. He loved the dichotomy. It pulled him. She pulled him. She turned her face as she talked to a blonde woman, and the light hit her cheek, exposing the small scar, freshly healed, just below her eye. Tucker's heart beat hard and fast in his chest, and he took a deep, calming breath. She hadn't looked in his direction all day. No wonder, since the last time he'd seen her, he'd looked like a clumsy teenager and had given her that scar. Plus, he was with someone. She wasn't. There was intelligence burning in her deep blue eyes, fire too, and enough rebelliousness that he knew she wouldn't be following any rules that she didn't agree with. There was a woman who was going to forge her own path. Tucker was drawn to her with a force he could hardly fight. But he did. Picking up the punch, he set his feet toward Abigail. Unlike Eve, she was perfect for everything that he needed to accomplish in his life. Since he'd turned 15 and decided the path for his life, there wasn't one time when he'd done what he wanted over what was necessary. Eve would not be his exception. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.